thank you again to everyone for being here. Again, we are Color Fandom, so basically we are a social organization based here in Love. I'm never good with these mics. I'll sit a little closer. So we are a social organization based here in the Triangle, and the primary reason that we exist is, well, first and foremost, to allow people to have a space to get together and just talk about and experience fandom. But the reason that we exist is to allow people who belong to marginalized communities to be able to talk freely and openly about the ways that their marginalized identities impact how they express their fandoms and how they interact with other people in the fan community. And of course, we're open to all, but we exist as a safe space for those conversations to exist and to be had. So the reason we're here today is to talk about the importance of diversity in historical fiction. As you all probably know, historical fiction as a subgenre across many other types of genres has for a long time been very white, very male, and that's changing in recent years. So we're here today to talk about some of the ways that the genre is changing. So we can introduce ourselves individually. My name is Robin. I am a local library staffer, actually here in the Triangle region, and I also host a podcast on diverse indie comics.
I just wanted to ask, are you all hearing a little ding with the microphone?
Yeah, I hear it too.
Okay, so maybe if
Let me back up a little bit.
we,
A little
maybe
bit.
if we move a little. Does that work better for y'all? Do you hear a ding?
That part, the sound system is just like that.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately.
Okay, that's fine. My name is Donna Eason, and of course I'm a member of Color Fandom.
And our founder.
And I created Color Fandom about 10 years ago, and we have approximately 500 members now in the Triangle. I am also the assistant head at Cary Academy, so if any of y'all know where Cary Academy is, it's right down the street basically, so that's me.
My name is Deborah Omer. I'm also a member of Color Fandom, and I own my own in-home bakery called Dee's Kitchen.
That's delicious. So if anyone wants vegan desserts, this is who you come to.
And Deborah always says member. She's one of our administrators. She keeps us going. She's like the lifeblood of our organization. All right, just really quickly, the agenda for today's discussion. So first we're going to talk about the importance of stories, basically how and why we consume stories. And then we're also going to delve into the audiences, different groups of people who are targeted by different types of stories and how those people are impacted by the stories that they consume. Then we're going to go over a few recommendations that we have for you guys on some ones that we think are very meaningful examples of diversity in historical fiction. And then we have some resources that we'll take you guys through. And also if you were able to pick up a program, we have some of the resources are outlined in there as well. And then we'll close out with some, if you guys have any questions or comments. All right, so first up, the importance of stories, how and why people consume stories. I'm going to turn it over to you, Donna, to take us through, just at a high level, some of the different ways that people get stories.
Okay, so the earliest known method of storytelling were actually in caves. So prehistoric people would draw on these caves that depicted their lives, their experiences, and that is really the earliest form of storytelling. There are a lot of ways throughout history stories have been communicated to different people. Oral traditions, some of you probably have family members who have told you stories. Those stories might be realistic, and I do it like that because they've made up elements, I'm sure. But this is how a lot of stories have been passed on and are still being passed on. in art. So art is not just a static image, it also tells a story in pictures, now in digital form, we see, and also in ceramics, in more physical art, in dance. These are also methods of telling a story. The stage, of course, we get our stories through that. Literature, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Television, film, digital media, we get our stories through there, especially now. A lot of people are getting their literature actually online. Hopefully you all are still using some paper books though. I'm an English teacher, so I'm still pumping up the paper books. Kindle's fine, but. And also in gaming. So if anyone has played any games, there are games where the stories have already been created and laid out for you, and you play through those games, somewhat static stories. But we also have RPGs in the, I guess, the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, if you've ever played that. That's where you're actually creating the story as you play along. Video games, same thing. Sometimes it's a static story you're playing through, but sometimes you are creating the story as you go along. And also LARPing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with LARPing, but what that stands for is live action role play. So instead of having a tabletop RPG, what you have is you're actually dressing up and physically playing out a game. So these are just, or playing out a story. So these are just some ways that we convey our storytelling.
And so I wanted to have us spend a little bit of time talking about why people consume stories. There is, of course, reading for pleasure, but then there's also reading for information. And a lot of times, stories have a combination of those two goals bound within them. And I think that's part of the reason why specifically historical fiction is so important. If either of you guys have any thoughts or comments about, especially around the ways that you were talking about, how we share stories and tell stories, and who we're including in or leaving out of those stories as we tell those stories.
I was thinking that reading, a lot of times people read for an escape or for comfort, and like for reading historical fiction, you want to get something, because our stories have been either erased or lost. You want to dive into something that you've never seen before, or you want to be in a world that you want, you've imagined yourself to be into. Or disappearing into a world that you don't currently live into.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important too for historical fiction, because like you were saying, a lot of people use it as a method of escapism. So when we see stories bound in historical fiction, we're kind of telling people what their own history looks like and what type of history they can be involved in. So when it's used for escapism, and everyone wants to have an opportunity to have those types of experiences, when we tell people, well, we're in this space that's defined by this historical aesthetic, but you didn't exist there. We're telling you that you don't belong here. You not only did you not exist in the past, but in the present, when we're recreating these stories, you don't belong in this space either.
And then when we think about, I mean, in general, why we tell stories or why we consume stories, there is the element, and this goes with, of course, historical fiction too, we are human, and we are getting human stories. Regardless of the time period, there are people that are existing. So there is this desire to connect not just with a time period that we may or may not have existed in. Those of you who, I was born in the 70s, so I'm dating myself, but that is historical fiction. If there's a story written in the 70s, 80s, that's something that I might be able to identify with. But I also might want to feel some type of connection with times that I didn't exist. Also, the hope, I think, with any type of storytelling is to help us develop or strengthen our sense of empathy. And when our stories are erased, there can be a lack there of developing a sense of empathy. But often, when we consume stories, especially when we have characters we love, or characters where we can find even just a little piece of ourselves in that character, we sort of develop that connection and empathy for the character. Historical fiction, although it is fiction, and it's very different, the understanding, of course, it's not history in terms of what actually happened, and it's sort of hard to define that in any type of historical document, because we know, and we're going to talk a little bit about who writes history anyway, and so we don't necessarily have a realistic depiction at any point when it comes to history. Historical fiction is typically looking at characters who existed during a time period or during an event, and so there's often in historical fiction a desire to search for truths. Those truths might be universal, they may be related to a particular culture, but when you have certain cultures that are not even allowed to exist in historical fiction, it's hard to even start to begin to seek out an element of truth. And then lastly, for me, I think reading and consuming stories is to make some type of meaning in the world. And so even in historical fiction, try to make some type of meaning of what may have happened or what a group may have experienced during that time.
So we're bleeding a little bit into the next topic, so I'll go ahead and move on to that. We're going to talk a little bit about the cultural impact and leaving a mark on society. So this is kind of a two-part question, and it taps into some of the points you were making just a second ago, Donna. So specifically, like, why fiction? A lot of the points that you just made about the importance of learning history, I think apply to, you know, everyone who exists within a specific community, within a specific culture. But why is fiction specifically so important in terms of telling those stories? Like, why not just have it be represented through nonfiction? And then the second part of that, what are some of the benefits and pitfalls of doing it that way, of having it as historical fiction?
Do you want to start with that?
Well, I can if you want to, unless you got some thoughts. Okay.
I'll just, go ahead.
You can tell stories in so many ways using fiction, because you can like appeal to everybody's senses and imaginations easier than just in nonfiction. And then you can use a lot of different ways to explore that in different types of art forms than just and things that you couldn't do in using nonfiction. And then the second part of your question.
Benefits and pitfalls, yeah.
Oh yeah, and
We can, if you're okay, I can jump onto some of that part too, that
Yeah.
you were talking about. I feel like fiction, kind of to your point, we see, sir, but we have a section at the end for audience comments, so we'll get you then, thank you. To your point, people's senses and sensibilities, right? I feel like fiction allows people to connect, to make a connection, because to the point that you were making in the other section as well, people read fiction and they involve themselves in stories as like a means of escape. You know, whether they want adventure or they want romance or whatever, they're either connecting themselves to the story themselves, the story itself, or connecting themselves to the character within that story. So a lot of issues I feel like that we have as society is making connections to other people that share the same space within our communities. And I strongly believe that a lot of that starts with empathy. And so when you have historical fiction as opposed to nonfiction, what that allows you to do is to create a connection to either the character or the situation in a way that you may not have been able to through nonfiction. So then it allows you to have a stronger connection to the people who are reflected in those stories in real life once you come out of the story. At least that's the way I view why doing it in fiction.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have my notes backwards. But yeah, that you can reach some different people in the type of stories, the different types of stories that they like you were saying. And then, like for me, like the, something that they didn't know about this particular part of history that makes me want to deep dive into the fiction grabs me to make me want to deep dive into the nonfiction part of it.
And a lot of time in fiction, especially if we're reading a biography, for instance, these are going to be the big name people who may have a huge impact on the world. We're not going to hear about this person who had a daycare or this person who worked the fields. So we have stories in historical fiction, we have stories of people who we wouldn't necessarily get that story in a historical document. And it allows us to broaden the landscape of a particular time or a particular experience. And so historical fiction is really good at pulling the experiences of maybe the everyday person versus what we might deem the hero of the time or a villain of the time or a big name of the time.
I think one of the benefits of historical fiction also is we've seen with this recent round, of course, everyone uses the example of Lovecraft Country about how there are certain aspects of our history that most people just don't know because those stories haven't been shared, those stories aren't propagated in education. And to the point that you were making earlier when you were kind of going through the ways that we tell stories, a lot of people's stories are told within sub-communities across our culture. I remember growing up, you know, when the whole thing exploded and people started learning about Tulsa and they were like, oh my gosh, this and that. I'm like, I remember my dad teaching me that when I was a kid. A lot of things where people were talking about, you know, the civil rights movement and stuff. And I'm like, my dad would take me to school and tell me those stories. You know what I mean? I learned about those stories in my home. And then I, later on when I became an adult and made friends outside of my culture, and they would tell me stories, and I was like, oh my goodness, I never heard that, because they had learned that within their culture. So those relationships allowed us to connect and to share stories across communities, but now having it in historical fiction gives people a ready access to it that they may not have had, because these things aren't being taught in schools, they aren't being widely taught, and that's the way a lot of people get their information, is through the stories that they consume in that way. A second benefit for that is in the wake of 2020, when people were having a lot of those conversations, people would start to like exhaust their friends who were part of marginalized communities. It's like, okay, you find your one LGBTQ friend, you know, to talk about those stories. You meet your one black friend and talk about those stories. We're like, I'm tired of telling the story to 15 people, you know. And it's like, okay, now that these ideas and these stories and this history is prevalent, like you were saying, Deborah, it gives people a launch pad to find out about the things that happen, so they're empathizing with these characters that are made real through these stories, and then they learn about historical facts in there, so now they can go tell their stories. So these conversations that we're having across cultural groups become more meaningful, become more sustainable because they have more depth, because people are now understanding what this history really means and how, and it gives you a different way to connect to people in your life and make stronger bonds because you understand the different aspects of their life that you may not have before. So talk about some, though, of the pitfalls of historical fiction, if you can think of any.
I can think of a lot of things.
Well, let's hear some.
Well, let me ask you this, when you talk about the pitfalls, do you mean more of how it goes wrong, or the problems with something being historical fiction versus history? I just want,
Well, both.
Okay.
I think your second point is a very good point. My main thought of it was, ways that it can go wrong, but also ways that the storytelling can go wrong.
okay.
Things that are left out, important things that may be left out of the story, things like that.
I think a major issue with historical fiction, and unfortunately even to this day, is just the whitewashing of historical fiction. Not only are people left out, but history's being rewritten as we sit even now, where events that did occur are now being portrayed in a different light. And so I think the fact that the predominant group of writers, in fact, as late as 2019, 95% of just fiction books were published by white writers, and oftentimes those writers were writing people like them. So leaving out or not giving a thorough understanding, or at least it doesn't even have to be complete understanding, because you're not going to get that from anyone. No one knows everything about the story. But leaving out some people who are contributors and members of American society limits not just the writer or we keep going to books, but of course, please understand we also mean film, and we mean all these other types of storytelling. It limits the consumer, regardless of your race or gender or identity in any way, but people are getting just a little piece of the story. So I think that that's a major pitfall, or how historical fiction is done incorrectly or limited.
And I mean, that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this panel, right? To talk about the importance of not just diversity in the stories themselves, but diversity in who is creating those stories. Because, like you said, there have been diverse people in historical fiction before now. Not enough, granted, but we did exist. But part of the problem was if our stories are told by a certain group of people who don't share that experience, and if it's censoring them. Perfect example, when you tell stories about the antebellum period and the Civil War and during American chattel slavery, a lot of stories, the way that Black people were portrayed was basically, as downtrodden. Even people who were heroic and noble were still always portrayed as downtrodden. I got very few, if any, exposure to Asian Americans. That was something that I started to learn about later in life through other types of historical fiction, mainly historical fiction, and it's still not perfect, through trying to consume more historical fiction by Black creators. Then I started to see that they were including Asian American characters, that their characters were impacting or interacting with. And so then I started to learn there and expand there. And don't even get me started about LGBTQIA representation. It was almost completely erased. So I think that is one of the pitfalls of existing historical fiction. But hopefully it's trying to right itself now by allowing more creators into that space.
And one of what we're seeing now, allowing more people into that space, we have to consider who are the gatekeepers of things that are being presented to the audience. Overwhelmingly and historically, it has been publishing companies and who dictate what they believe the audience wants. So if companies, or what they want to produce, so if it is, okay, well, no one really wants to hear a story about this African American who is, during slavery time, was free and invented this thus and so thing, or just lived free, then that won't be created. So it's this guess that this is not what people want to hear, so we're not going to allow people, or we're not going to publish works. The benefit now is that you're getting more companies, more publishing companies that are either owned by marginalized groups or developing larger numbers. We have more self-publishing writers, more independent movie creators, producers and directors. And so I think that is, with this righting the wrong, that is where we're seeing some growth. It's almost, what has had to happen is people are having to activate themselves versus having established companies realize that there is such a need for this.
And I think too, another important benefits of diversity in historical fiction is through a lot of these stories, there's like a through line of just like a universal experience, because you've talked before like about the hero's journey and everything, and how people can connect to that and insert themselves into that. So seeing stories portrayed in a way that does that, that makes it more of a journey as opposed to just kind of like all of these facts thrown at you, allow people who do not belong to that certain community to find ways that they connect to a specific character, even though their experiences and things that people who look like them historically may not have mirrored that. There are things either through the character's personality, their decisions that they're making, some of the situations that they may be put into, that someone can find a way to connect to that, and then take that empathy out into the real world when they're connecting to other people within their communities. Any other pitfalls that you can think of?
Just if the taking history and using it as telling your story, but using it at the expense of putting down someone else's story.
Yeah.
Especially another marginalized group to boost up your story.
Oh, 100%, yeah. Yeah, I feel like the concept of punching down, where people talk about having, like telling, it's usually applied to like comedy, right? People are talking about privileged groups making fun of marginalized groups, basically for laughs or for jokes or to tell their story. That is one. There was something, and I won't name it specifically, that I watched that was a Black story that used an indigenous character as basically like a plot device, like a comedic plot device to tell the main character's story as well. And in that particular instance, I looked at that as punching down as well, because even though the main character is from a marginalized community as well, in that specific instance, they are using them, kind of like you were saying, as a plot device, and harming them in that way. So some of the issues that we've had with historical fiction previously, because I mean that's probably part and parcel of one of the biggest issues that we've had with like white creators telling stories of marginalized communities where they don't even understand that they are doing that. Like we don't want to go forward replicating those same types of problems when we have more diverse people creating and sharing their own stories as well.
And I think, and this kind of ties into whitewashing, but this element of fear or revising history. The element of fear that writers may have that if I do talk about if my historical fiction takes place during slavery and I present the realities of slavery, people are going to be offended, upset. I'm afraid to do this because there may be backlash. And so I would rather pretend like it didn't exist or just touch on it marginally. And if I'm going to have a person of color, because what we have sometimes is this situation where a writer may have diversity in the sense that there is a person of color, or there's a person who's a member of the LGBTQIA community, or that person exists in the story, but that is not necessarily inclusion. So diversity and inclusion are two different things. When I think of inclusion, that's talking about a character that has a richness of a story versus diversity. There are numbers in there. They just represent a seat, you know. Yeah, and so people sometimes may feel, my story is diverse. I have a black character, and I have an Asian character, and I have a character who, you know, I have all these different groups represented, but none of those stories are told because the writer may feel as if that writer is not a part of that group, so feels that the writer should not try to touch on trying to write a character like that. So I'll just let that person exist, but that the culture of that person is not represented at all. And I think that can happen because of sometimes fear of what will happen if I do that. And there have been instances where people have received backlash for doing things like that. So they've received praise and received backlash when trying to develop a rich, marginalized character.
Yeah. I think part of that goes to one of the points you were making before about like what is profitable, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like there was a point in time where this was new ground for people, mm-hmm. right? And I think that's where a lot of people kind of get fatigued with this. Like right. When it was new ground and people were trying, it's like, okay, great effort. Here's how you can make these things better. Mm-hmm. I think the concept of like sensitivity readers right. evolved out of that when people were like, you know, okay, you've got these marginalized characters, here are some ways that can be improved, you know, but if it's either too much work or too costly or whatever, and people would, like you said, well, I'd rather just not include them as opposed to including them in a meaningful, well thought out way. So now there's more backlash around that because people are starting to be fatigued. Because some of the old excuses of, oh, well, I didn't understand how to do this, I didn't know how to do this, it's like, okay, we gotcha. That was true maybe like 4, 5, 6 years ago, but now we've provided solutions. Mm-hmm. So if you choose not to use the tools that you have at hand now, that we've done the work to provide for you to make these stories better, then you can't fall back on those same excuses for why the stories that you're propagating are still repeating some of these same old problems, because we've had this conversation before, and now you're basically requiring people to have this conversation again. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of where some of the backlash comes from around that.
I'm glad you brought up sensitivity readers, because that in itself has its advocates and the adversaries when it comes to sensitivity readers. Because on one hand, yes, here are the tools. We are here to help you. But the backlash is censorship. now you're requiring, now you're censoring this work, you know, and that's the problem with sensitivity readers is they are pointing out and changing the work. And this was an issue with Ian Fleming's work. There were like some big cases with certain writers when people were saying, this is problematic, okay, and we're just trying to tell you why. Oh, now this is, so writers and editors and publishers were angry with the concept of sensitivity readers because of the limiting nature.
So I hear what you're saying, and I feel like there's like a nuanced balance in that. So certain things have already been created, and they were created and developed in a certain time in our country's history. You know what I mean? So they were created with the understanding that people had at that time. But new things that are created, fast forward to 2024, even before that, 2023, you know, to recent years where new things are being created. Because I understand what people are saying, okay, you're taking an existing work and editing it, especially when the creator is no longer with us. That same criticism cannot be, in my opinion, cannot be applied to new works being created and developed. If this work has not yet been published, then there is an opportunity to have those conversations. They should be had. And using a criticism against modifying a work that is 40, 50, 60 years old is not, to me, is not applicable to a work that is being developed right now. We have different understandings, we have different cultural understandings, different sensibilities, different knowledge bases, and stories that are created today. If you want to create a meaningful story, in my opinion, they should be created within that context, not within the context that existed 60 years ago. Stories that were created 60 years ago existed in their context. Stories that are created now should be created in our context. That's just...
And I agree with you that I think that...
Y'all can see this little sore spot for me.
But I mean, and I definitely agree. I think that also some of the issues, not issues, but something that, and I think the sensitivity readers that I do know do this, just like something that you keep saying is the conversation. So not just, okay, write this, write that, write this, but let's have a conversation about how this is going to impact people. Why maybe this should be done this way or something like that. So there's more to this than someone who's taking a red pen to something and just marking it. So I do believe there is a difference between the past and now, and even now, I believe that it should be a conversation as part of the process.
So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next next section, unless anyone has anything, either of you two have anything else for this section. Okay. All right, we just wanted to put this up here very quickly. So a lot of the fiction that we're talking about is primarily American fiction because we're all American. And so that's the majority of what we consume, American media, Western media, which a lot of times includes like British media and such. But we just wanted to kind of throw this up there for people's reference on time periods throughout American history where historical fiction exists. So the next piece that we wanted to talk about was the audiences. So who is affected by the stories that we tell? So mainly for this, I'm thinking like different age ranges as one, and then different communities, different pockets of people. Either one of you want to start and take this?
I just had one word in my note, which was everyone. That's it. That was my note.
So I definitely think that historical fiction in general is for everyone, but I feel that the way that we tell those stories differ, especially now a lot of the book bans that we're coming across are because people are saying that children are too young and too sensitive for certain information, certain types of stories, and how they are affected by certain types of stories. One of the things that I see repeatedly is as justification for banning a book is that, specifically like topics of slavery, topics around like the Holocaust may be too much for kids to learn, but as a Black child, I was taught those stories. You know what I mean? Like, as an American child, I feel like in order for us to have a thorough understanding of what our history looks like, we have to like make the effort to figure out ways to tell these stories that are appropriate for different audiences. And a lot of that is starting to change now. We do have different series of historical fiction that features some of those kind of like devastating points in our history, and they're just kind of like mindful of the way that they tell the stories. Like, you may not show like a lynching, like you're not gonna put a lynched person or describe that in detail in a story that's for a child, but you can say like, the father was taken. You know what I mean? You can find ways to tell stories about things that happened to people to make it more sensitive for younger audiences.
Yeah, I agree. Going back to, how where you were saying, like, how we originally told, stories as far as, like, passing stories down, when we're to kids when we're younger, and using storytelling, and like in storytelling you use pictures and use drawing and use dance, and that's ways to tell for each age group so they can comprehend, and you don't have to put as much of the violence into it, but you can get through to them the story point. So I think you can tell the story for any age group, you just have to use it so they can comprehend.
My students, this actually happened yesterday. This is a fictional story, it's just not historical fiction, but my students are reading this book called They're There. This book talks about, the prologue of the book talks about the treatment of indigenous peoples in America. And my students are high school students, and so they were talking about how they never knew these things that they were hearing in this prologue. And I asked them, why do you think that's the case? And they were like, well, you wouldn't tell young kids these, because it's very explicit what's at the beginning. It's age appropriate because these are 10th graders. And they were saying, well, you wouldn't teach kids this type of stuff. And so another kid raised his hand. He said, well, wait a minute. We were told about the Holocaust, and some of that was very explicit. So I said, okay, so why do you think you got the Holocaust story, but you didn't get this story? And one child, and I love my class because those kids are on me. He said, well, that's because the Holocaust was done there. It was the other. Things that happen here, that means we have to look at ourselves. And so that can also be the reason, not just this information is too explicit, but who is it talking about? And so, right, and so I did that. Oh, and then I said, well, you're saying we, who is we? I said, are these indigenous, who's American? And then they had to think about it, and my class is majority Asian American students. They said, oh, well, we is white America. I said, well, are you American? They were like, yeah, but no, not in terms of story. And so, the fact that they are, as young as they are today, they're understanding the idea that their story is excluded and is accepted. But they were starting to realize this and get angrier and angrier. I was like, yes, I'm doing my job then. So
I love something that interaction where you said, well, who's American? And your student responded, we are American, but not in terms of story.
right.
And to me, that in itself epitomizes why diversity in historical fiction is so important. Because I think in everyday connections, everyday conversations, like, no one would deny that we are American, Black Americans, we're Americans, Indigenous Americans are Americans, Asian Americans are Americans. But in the context of how our stories are told, an American story is a white story.
Yeah.
And that's why this needs to happen. That's why diversity in historical fiction needs to happen.
Yeah. And every culture like has their way of telling their stories and passing down their stories. And then if everybody comes together in the way that everybody teaches their stories to their own children and use that same way, we can all learn each other's stories together.
And I actually remember having a conversation, probably like 6, 7, 8 years ago now, with some friends of mine who are white, and explaining that I actually have stronger connections, more connections with people who are white when we do share these kinds of stories, when we can have these conversations. Because if I feel that you are going to shy away from a story that allows me to be fully represented, then I'm going to also assume that you're going to shy away from just perspectives about me, aspects of me that allow me to be fully represented. So I'm not going to feel like I have to be myself around you. But if I can feel comfortable that we can have these conversations openly and honestly, then I can feel vulnerable around you, and we can make stronger, more meaningful connections because we can share these things, as opposed to you shying away from those things. So I remember growing up, regardless of what type of story it was, if it had a Black character, Barnes & Noble had an African American fiction section, regardless of what that story was, and all of it was over there, and white people were like, oh, I didn't think that was for me because it says African American at the top. Now it's just a fiction story, it's an American story, because like your student said, if we are not part of America in terms of our stories, then that's going to exclude us and separate us. And by taking that wall down, it allows us to be American together in the way that we're telling our stories.
Because another point that's related to that is the African American story is the American story. So it is a white American story. It is an Asian American story. It is, so all of these stories are related to all of us, you know, as it relates to being American. Just like a human story, regardless of where you're from, is related to us because it is a human story. So, you know, having these distinctions, although we do know that people like to categorize things, but I think in the categorizing of things, what's lost is understanding that all of these stories are related to all of us, not just one particular group.
Right, because a lot of times these groups, even though, you know, you may go back to your neighborhood and you have like a lot of experiences with people who look like you, like we weren't completely siloed, we were interacting with each other, crossing paths and things like that, you know. So now, looking at the time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We talked about this already, age ranges. We're going to talk just very quickly about different genres and how, why, and what these genres do in terms of historical fiction. So Donna, I think you have a list to talk about the slight definition of some of the genres.
Just some of them. I mean, I think you all know what romance, you probably don't have to describe what romance is. Magic realism, if you're just not familiar with that, this is a style that you will see in literature and in art, but it is taking a realistic view of the world and adding some magical elements to them. So there's sort of a blur between the lines of fantasy and reality. Just to throw out one author that's just really known for this, Toni Morrison's books are often considered magic realism. And there's some other examples of books, but I'll wait till we get a little bit later. It was another genre, I don't know if, Well, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with steampunk, so we have that up here. You might be familiar with steampunk, okay? Steampunk usually is the Victorian age, the time period is roughly Victorian age. You get a lot of steampunk European, but obviously that Victorian age existed all over the world. Typically the story settings of steampunk as it relates to America is during the time period, it might be a Civil War-ish time period, okay? Pre-Civil War to Civil War. So steampunk, same time period, but we're focused more on people from the African diaspora. So you may, and this term was coined really in like around 2000, I think it was a little bit earlier than 2012. So it's pretty new. So any of those punk, cyberpunk, diesel punk, steampunk, if you just add the funk instead of punk, then it's just the people that it focuses on. And that's, so you see a lot of, during slave times where you have Harriet Tubman, for instance, who is the hero, who's, you know, kicking butt in these stories. So those are two that I just wanted to make sure everybody knew those particular genres.
Yeah. So,
Did you go?
Oh, no, I just had a couple, oh, no, just some ones that I added in my notes that we had in the recommendations that were crime and war dramas that tend to have historical fiction, especially in TV and movies. And they often depict experiences through different eyes and emotions of how that particular person was affected that you wouldn't normally see.
Yeah. And when we say genre, that's just really a very generic term for art, be it literature, movies, whatever. That's considered not literary or, you know, not highbrow, I guess. So that's why we have these particular ones listed.
yeah. So, I listed these specifically because I think these, I was gonna say kind of like do something to you, but in a way, having representation in these genres do affect the way we look at each other. Romance, I think, is the most powerful example because I feel like it subverts traditional ideas of who is deserving to be loved and also what their roles are in those relationships. Because a lot of times in romance, you wouldn't see anyone who was not demure and white as the heroine in historical fiction, other than like Beverly Jenkins. That was really the only time, and a lot of people who were not black were not aware of her stories. Oops. But it allows women of color to be seen as deserving of love. Because a lot of those stereotypes that we have around black women and their worth in our society are kind of like mired in hypersexuality and or our labor. And so allowing us to be at the central point of a romance story allows us to be seen in a way outside of those stereotypes. And then also having LGBTQIA representation in romance. First of all, just shows you that people existed in those time periods. Because one of the things that I hear constantly is like, people are like, oh, everybody's gay now. It's like, no, people have been gay for a long time.
Since people existed.
Right. but we haven't told stories about those relationships. And a lot of times people who were LGBTQIA had to hide that part of their identity. So it wasn't that those stories weren't around, it was that under threat of imprisonment and or sometimes death, they weren't allowed to share those stories. But now being able to tell stories that existed in those time periods and the things that they had to go through, I think is especially pivotal now that we see so much pushback against LGBTQIA rights, because it just shows that these things are like an example of history repeating itself, and how people have existed and been fighting these fights just different ways. How the fact that they've existed hasn't changed, the way that they've had to fight these fights is what has changed.
And even in addition to what people have had to endure in the LGBTQIA community in terms of being able to share their relationships, when you don't have this representation, people come to their own conclusions about how these relationships are and forget, no, it was somebody who had to come home and was mad because probably something wasn't cooked, or who's gonna do this now, who's taking out trash. Just people's lives being real people. You don't get, when you don't have stories, just like when you're talking about, you don't see yourself in terms of maybe how you look or how you were able to act, or a lot of these stories, the whole story might not be about the fight with society. It is what it's like to just be in a relationship. And those stories, with the erasure of the stories, then people come up with their own ideas of this relationship must be totally different than a relationship that might be between a man or a woman. It's like, no, relationships are relationships. So there is that lack of understanding the humanity of people and the experiences that actually all of us share regardless of our relationships and who we are in relationships with.
Yeah, I think that's really important to just talk about how it humanizes people, because, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but at one point, I had seen so few representations of LGBTQIA relationships that I just assumed that they were all gold, and once two gay people were able to get together, it was perfect. But now that we're able to see, they have the same struggles as everybody else, it does just makes it, like you said, humanizes and adds a connection where you can complain about your partner and it's the same things where your partner won't pick up their socks off the floor,
Right.
That's just a universal truth, across relationships. So another one I had notes for was horror, and we got a whole other panel about horror because there's a lot, especially specifically for marginalized experiences with horror. But for that one, I think even though it is a lot of times very well done when it's done in historical fiction, some of the things that that does is just allows people to see how devastating it was, and to be in those situations, and almost makes the real life situations and turning it into a monster and making having that fantastical element around the things that people are dealing with in the real world always makes, to me, for an interesting story.
I think with horror, sometimes, especially when you're dealing with marginalized people, there are almost two levels of horror, especially if it has a supernatural element. So you have the horror of the real world, and then you have the supernatural element of horror. Then you might have an internal, something else going on, so the horror is just like Rob said, it's magnified. So it's not just making the social or the conditions of society into a monster. You have that one too. You have all these different levels of horror when it comes to marginalized people. Yeah, so with with westerns and with steampunk. So a lot of times people think of, if any of you have ever watched westerns back in the day, my mother-in-law loves them. And there's so much brown and blackface going on in westerns that you would just, you're surprised that, oh, you know, indigenous people are not white with just paint, you know. So there is this idea also that indigenous people in westerns are villains, and that's what they're the bad guy. We, the Americans, are always having to fight them. Black people seem to not even exist when you watch any of these old westerns, or it might be one or two. So when you don't have marginalized people represented in westerns and in steampunk, you also lose stories about, and this is actually, I can even pull in science fiction with this, the fact that people are of different races and of different genders, are creative and innovative and created things, and the things that you would get in steam. Because steampunk and steampunk, there's a whole lot of that technology in the past type connection going on there. And so when you add marginalized people in the story, or if the story's focused on marginalized people, there is this idea that, oh yeah, that's right. A lot of different types of people created things, or and then when you look at, just like I mentioned, Harriet Tubman, you know, she's bad, she's tough in these stories. You get that power, that it's not just during this time of slavery, everyone was downtrodden, but you get the people fighting back, you know, you get these characters being able to do these things that you usually only see the white heroes doing, the white straight heroes doing.
I think the sweet spot for me in that is like right after slavery up until like the early 1900s, because that was the time where black ingenuity was allowed to thrive before we had this white resistance and this white, well, I shouldn't say before, because it existed all through that time period, but we had like so many thriving black communities that were able to thrive. They had businesses, they governed themselves, and I think that's kind of like the sweet spot where we get steampunk stories, because we had these communities that, and again, in part of historical fiction, we were never told that they existed. But they did exist, and they were destroyed because of basically white rage, that they did exist and they could exist. So I think allowing characters to thrive in that time has the overlap of showing the horror that was done to them, but also the ingenuity and the vigor and the vitality of these communities that did thrive right in the wake of the Civil War ending.
Rarely during this time do you see how Chinese Americans thrive during this. I don't know how many of you have ever seen it. This is a movie that's done poorly, so I like the movie in some ways, but From Hell, if you've ever seen that movie, and during this time period, it's sort of like a Victorian time period, or late 1800s, early 1900s. Any Chinese person, Chinese American, Chinese immigrant in America or in England during this time period is running or existing in an opium den. That's all you would see. And so the villainizing or making these this group drug addicts, but we don't get the story of the thriving communities that were actually happening throughout the time that people immigrated to America. So that is a time period where it's not just the erasure of African Americans, but the erasure of so many groups, and villainizing these groups.
So unless you guys have anything else, you can go ahead and move
Yeah.
on to the next. So now we're gonna go through some recommendations really quick, and I should have pulled this up on a different thing, so I have to turn around. But these are some recommendations that I had around books and graphic novels, and please forgive me for turning my back to you. I should have thought about this a little better when I was writing my notes. I'm not going to go through every one, just some of my favorites. So I'll start in the upper left-hand corner with Shadow Hero by Gene Yang. I love his work. Any comic that he puts his name on, I'm probably going to read. But it was just like such a fun story. It was set in the 40s with a Chinese American first generation immigrant who existed when Superman existed. So his mom was totally enthralled with Superman and keeps like accidentally dumping like the dirty laundry water on her son to try to get him to have like superpowers. But it was really a ton of fun. It just shows the aesthetic of just like a normal family trying to exist during that time. Indigo is a historical romance that I just absolutely love. It is an adventure story about a young woman who is a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She keeps people safe in her basement, and she ends up meeting and falling in love with a driver who is bringing escaped slaves from Louisiana, and he is part of an affluent family during that time. So he is an affluent person, and she is not downtrodden, but she's relatively poor. So like you have the disconnect of different classes during that time, even though they're both Black. And you just also have a lot of history around the Creole culture during that time that you don't normally get exposure to. So that one, and also Last Night at the Telegraph Club, they both included in the back bibliographies about different stories, about different historical references that the authors used in those. And I think that's another huge benefit to historical fiction, is that they tell you, they're like, here's where I did my research, and you can do that same research. Bitterroot is my absolute favorite. I love it so much. So it is both horror and steampunk, and it's set during the 20s. I love Sanford Green's art. But the story follows the Sangrier family. They are basically demon hunters, and they create the serum from the fipno root that they use to fight the demons. Basically, there are forces at play that are turning people through racism, turning them into monsters. But one of the other very key things about this book is that it has essays from historical scholars and African American cultural scholars throughout the book. So after you finish reading this very cool adventure story, you get to learn a little bit of history and culture and anthropology through these essays that are in the back of each graphic novel that's part of the 3-volume series. And I'm going to let you guys go through some of your favorites. I'm going to talk about every single one there, but yeah.
Okay, let's try to do this quickly. My recommendations are, and then I have honorable mentions. So I grouped them all in together, so I'm trying to read this quick. But AMC's Interview with a Vampire, which is set from the 1910s. Our Flag Means Death, which is in the 1800s, and Portrayed, which is set in 1719, with a TV series and a film, because that's how I consume most of everything. But in Interview and Our Flag, both deal with issues of class and high society, race, culture, and sexual identity within oneself and the outside world, all while being a romance and found family story too. One thing that our flag and my honorable mention, the series Continental, which is set in the 1970s, based in the world of John Wick, does well is it subverts gender roles and norms to almost a level of non-existence for a lot of the characters. One thing that Interview and the new Color Purple musical movie does, which is also set in the early 1900s, is it gives a full and multiple display of Black culture and costuming from Africa to the early 1900s America. And then lastly, Prey, and then Marvel's new series on Disney Plus, Echo, and What If Season 2, Episode 6 are set in widely known franchises and properties that are telling indigenous main point of view character stories, using native actors and crew. And they also work in connection with the different nations in each of the movie, story, and series. And they have also they did film it in language, and they also have dubbed the full movie. Prey is also fully dubbed in language. So those are my recommendations.
And I have 3, The Harder They Fall. This was in 2021 on Netflix. It's a Western. One of the things I really like about it is it is a town pretty much run by Black people, and the villains are Black, the heroes are Black, and it stars, of course, some major actors. The Terror Infamy, this is season 2 of the show, The Terror, which was on AMC, which I think is still on AMC. And it takes place right after World War II. It's set in a Japanese internment camp or internment camps. And so there is, of course, like we said, the dual in terms of horror where you're dealing with the social implications of what's going on, but also there's a ghost element that's going on, and so the cast is Asian. George Takai is also in that one, so that's one of the major actors in that, along with other actors. And I want to talk about a game. This is a tabletop RPG called Harlem Unbound, so it takes place during the 1920s, during the Harlem Renaissance. If any of y'all are tabletop gamers, this is a whole lot of fun. It has a Cthulhu element to it. The creator, Chris Spivey, actually created 2 other games. One is called Haunted West, so it's a Western game, and Cthulhu Confidential, which is like a 1930s detective noir game. So he likes the Cthulhu monster element in his games, and most of his characters definitely, and Chris Spivey is an African American. His central characters are African American. He has characters actually who are of different races, different ethnicities, but the storylines all involve the experiences of people from marginalized groups during these time periods. And so if you like the game, it might take a long time because these games go forever, but they're a whole lot of fun.
And another thing I wanted to point out about Chris Spivey's RPG guides, he has in the front, if you're in white GM, here are some ways to be sensitive around these topics as you are crafting the story for your players, and here are ways to respect the marginalized communities, the marginalized identities of your players that you may not share. So if people have any hesitation about diving in, he's like right there to kind of guide you through those. So I thought that was really meaningful in that. Just one more quick thing, we wanted to show you some examples of some resources. And this is kind of what I was talking about before in those, oh, my little thing, I need to format it. So the first one is just a quick picture of one of the essays inside of Bitterroot, and then the bibliographies from Indigo and Last Night at the Telegraph Club. And also, at the end of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, there's a whole just essay in the back of that as well that talks about the history of queer Asian Americans in the 50s during the Red Scare of communism. So it's a really interesting historical perspective to learn about, especially after you've just finished reading the story, connecting to these characters that are literally going through exactly that. And these are just some of the resources that we've kind of been talking about with you guys, where you can get, so Darker Hue Studios is a publishing company that creates the games that Donna was talking about, Haunted West, Harlem Bound, and these are also in the program as well, so you have those there. MB Media is the publisher, it's a small press, and I think Milton coined those terms, like the twist on where he's making like steampunk, cyberpunk. So he has a lot of stories within those genres. And then we have the Lovecraft Country lesson plan, which goes through a lot of the historical elements that are touched upon in that series. LGBTQ Reads is a website that I love to go to just find you know, what my next read is going to be. And they have a section there specifically for historical fiction featuring queer characters. And then Beyond Victoriana is a blog that is by a Asian American woman who is very prolific in the steampunk community, just sharing her experiences and a multicultural perspective about being a fan in that space. So thank you guys for coming. Does anyone have any comments or any questions or anything for us?
I just want to say thank y'all so much. Y'all were so engaging, and I was like pulling up my little app and like, okay, let me go ahead and put this book on, you know, reserve. So just from your experience, and obviously the group has been around for a long time, what would you say is the reason why it seems to be so much of a push now to have representation? I love like your movie and TV references where it's like, you know, you having the native indigenous population represented, you have the LGBTQ population. What would you say is the reason, probably in the past 5 years, why there's so much outpouring of making sure everyone is accountable and everyone is represented?
There was really, in the research I've done, it's almost a singular time that where we're seeing more of a push now. The biggest push right now is actually 2020, the summer of 2020 with George Floyd.
If I was home.
And that was when things picked up like crazy, but then there was backlash and all that stuff coming out too during that time. But that was one moment where we did start to see a lot of people wanting to push out some more diversity.
And I've read pieces by different scholars who try to determine specifically why that is. Mainly the assumption is because everyone was at home because of the pandemic. They had more time on their hands to actually follow through with some of the things, because a lot of things that were happening during 2020, they didn't just happen in 2020.
Right.
It had been happening. But being home allowed people to actually kind of sit with those feelings and to be able to take the time and actually consume those stories and the news that was coming out, and to start thinking about how does that actually impact me as a person. And that's kind of where my references to like the fatigue happened, where like I had so many people who were just like casual acquaintances of mine come out and be like, oh, well, what's this and what's this and what's this? And I was just like, oh my God, I'm answering the same question 18 times. So I started actually put together like a spreadsheet of like just diverse books for kids. Cause like that was the thing that a lot of people were just asking me for, like the same questions over and over again. And I put together an anti-racist podcast playlist. Cause I was like, people were asking me the same questions. And I was like, here's a list of like some podcasts that I've listened to that I think do a good job of this. Just listen, I'm not having this conversation with y'all, like 18 different people, the same exact conversation. And that's kind of where I was talking about, like, when I've had relationships with people who are either white or they have a different privilege than me. It could have been like a class privilege, or maybe they're het and I'm bi or something like that, where, you know, we can move to the next step beyond that. We can have meaningful conversations, and we have been having those conversations. So now, you know, it was just kind of a seamless transition into talking about and us being able to empathize with each other around that moment, as opposed to them just asking me for emotional labor. You know what I mean? Because in that time, I was hurting too. I needed a friend also. And people who had existed in my life before then, who already knew those kinds of things, they knew the answers to those questions. So we've been having those conversations. They could just sit with me and empathize with me and be a friend to me. And so I feel like now, post-2020, people are starting to have those relationships with people. They're starting to have those connections and move beyond just a very surface level of what does this mean, you know.
What's very interesting to look at, if any of you go to LinkedIn or go to any place where people are getting looking for jobs, look at the beginning of 2021, the director for diversity, inclusion, equity and inclusion jobs, almost skyrocket. Every university, school, company was trying to hire someone to fulfill that role.
Thank you for your comment. Any questions? Anyone else have any thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Could it be that these are new markets, the LGBTQ and the minor ethnic and racial minorities
Yeah.
are spending and spending in a big way.
Yeah.
They're smaller populations, but nevertheless, they're spending in a big way.
So I think
And that could be one of the reasons.
Oh, for sure. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really great point. In terms of, kind of to what you were saying before, they are new markets for major companies.
Yeah.
So like these stories have kind of existed underground, you know, like
Yeah.
we're seeing like how we're learning about like drag houses and things like that, and it's becoming very popular now, but these have existed back since like the late 1800s. So like a lot of those stories have been passed within community. They've been like intra-community stories that they have to earn their money maybe through like a performance or something, or like they're printing zines or like self-publishing. So you're right, it was a small market, but they were sharing stories intra-community. But now that a wider audience is able to, is interested in those stories. And then also a lot of times those stories were very hard to find, because like a lot of my indie stories, like I would get at like conventions or like at a local bookstore or something like that. And now we can connect Black communities across the country. We can connect LGBTQI communities like up and down the coast, as opposed to just like pockets here and there. And I think that's where we have like a very tricky balance, where we do want more representation, we want authentic representation, we want people who are in positions of power and privilege to be interested in telling our stories and helping to propagate our stories, but we have to be very careful of that slippery slope into appropriation and exploitation. Because I think that that's what's kind of to your point before, where people are like, oh, I don't want to do that, I just want to be able to do this, because they're seeing that these groups have money and they are a market, and that they can make a quick profit by catering to them in a certain way, and so they may potentially be doing them in ways that are inauthentic. And I think that that's why it's really important for us now to make sure that we are kind of holding people to account when they're telling these stories, when they're trying to when they're trying to create these stories and make these stories available for communities that they may not share that marginalized identity of the characters that they're telling.
I wanted to, we were talking about avenues of story, and the history of stories, and having stories on the wall, the cave wall, and things like that. As you know, they recently discovered a continent that is underwater. And there is a lot of room for fiction and nonfiction there. As they study this continent more and more, there may be some nonfiction that will arise. And there's room for fiction. A lot of room for fiction. There's a lot of room for fiction in space travel. That there are places where human beings have not been before. And they might go and find some kind of evidence of technology, which is a story.
Oh, we're working on that panel.
I was going to say, hopefully we'll be brought back on the futurism.
And then last but not least, there's been a lot of talk of time travel. You know.
Yeah.
And
You know,
there's no evidence that that can be done, but if it is done, that's room for more fiction and nonfiction.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
What do y'all think of stories where a black character is depicted in a setting, usually like geographically, that doesn't usually have black people in there? So usually like, say like a black person like medieval Europe or in Steel of Japan or something like that.
So I saw a little bit of research about that, so thank you for bringing that question, because that came up. Where looking at history, there are basically, and I'm not quoting anybody, and I don't want you to take this as this is the gospel, but there's practically no place on earth where people of color did not exist. So medieval England or medieval Europe had plenty of black people there. Oftentimes, and this goes to fantasy, so I'm just jumping to fantasy, a lot of times people have had issues with Middle Earth. So let's say Tolkien's book saying, well, why would you have a black hobbit? Because black hobbits did not exist. Well, Middle Earth didn't exist, you know, that's fiction. But historical fiction, especially when you look at Queen Elizabeth historical fiction, there were plenty of black people in England during that time period. There were black people here before, in America, before Columbus, before the people that we get in our history books. So oftentimes, because of the stories we're told in history, we believe the people did not exist there, so why would they be in a historical fiction book, when in actuality they did. So, but we're not taught that, so that's why we don't know.
Yeah. There are a couple books on my massive TBR list, but one of them is Black Tutors, that talks about black people that existed during that time. And there was another book that I cannot remember, probably have a notepad somewhere, about a black samurai who was of African descent. I forget what his name was though.
It was like Sasuke or something.
Yeah.
There was a Netflix show.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay, okay, I have to look that up, yeah.
That was good.
But yeah, kind of to Donna's point, there were people of color all over the planet, and you may have had kind of like we have here in America, where we have like the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood, where like you may not see like a lot of people here or there, but they do exist and they cross back and forth, and you know sometimes there'll be one or two families here and then they move, and you know what I mean, and they don't come back for like maybe 2 decades. A different family moves in, but there's precedent there for those people existing, and I think a lot of the pushback against having that representation is because of the way that embracing those cultures maintains that current power dynamic more so than any type of interest in historical accuracy.
It was a story I think I remember hearing about Black Vikings, and that was really cool. You know, I was like, oh, okay, because I love Viking history. So. Yes,
I
ma'am.
just want to go back to what you said earlier that came to mind, the Tulsa Massacre. And I remember I had seen and read the graphic novel Watchmen, and I've seen the movie. And I remember the HBO special where it introduced the Tulsa Massacre as part of the Watchmen story. And I remember seeing something where they say, like, basically the hours after the premiere on HBO, the search spiked. That people did not realize this was history. Like the planes bombing. Yeah, we're watching something about, you know, magnificent superheroes and time and American history changing. But the Tulsa Massacre happened. So just to see what your thoughts are when we incorporate actual historical events in fictional settings. Do you feel that that sort of inspire more people to sort of delve and go beyond? Like if it if it mentioned the Tulsa Massacre, maybe you research it, maybe you want to go from that point to the Wilmington Massacre or the other massacre or Rosewood. Do you feel that having the minority representation in historical fiction sort of inspires people to go beyond to actually look at the nonfiction behind the fiction?
What was also cool about Watchmen, Lovecraft Country mentions it, is that it was taking place, those came out around the 100-year anniversary. So we're seeing presidents and we're seeing it on the news as well. I wonder how much, even though it was a 100-year anniversary, how much we would have seen information about it if those shows hadn't come out. So making it a part of pop culture. Pop culture, a lot of ways, shapes, more than anything else, can shape what happens, you know, with the audience, or what happens with the people in that society.
Yeah.
So.
And just, yeah, like, I mean, like, the terror, like, when I didn't know, or, yeah, like, or the episode in Lovecraft Country, about, in, the war episode.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But, like,
Korea, I think it was
Korea War, like, I didn't know a lot about internment camps. And, you know, and then when George Takei came out with his biography, in graphic novel form, that, you know, that always sparked me into, like, going more into, you know, learning about the real part of what happened in the history of it.
And I think it has the other added benefit. A lot of people generally consider just history as a subject to be very dry. But historical fiction gets people, in my view, historical fiction gets people excited about history, right? Because it creates a narrative, and you create a hero and a villain, and sometimes they're along very distinct lines of like race, and sometimes they're not. And because you do have other opportunities to share stories where you have people, as opposed to just having like the white savior narrative, you can still represent white people in a way that doesn't center them, but doesn't always make them the villain if you're crafting a story that people are thoughtful about and meaningful about. But the biggest thing is that that excitement that it draws, and it makes people interested and want to learn about it. People want to be able to see themselves projected back into that time period where they're in the role of the hero. So then they want to learn more about those things. And then for those of us who are represented during those times who may have learned about those things in a strictly historical context, as opposed to having our narratives framed one way, we get to learn about different aspects of them. We get to make them whole people, as opposed to just kind of like the thing that was done to them. Because I've learned a lot about like the Underground Railroad and slavery and all those things, but getting to see them in an adventure story, like in that story Indigo, you know what I mean? Instead of just reading like, oh God, all these things that happen to my people. Now it's like a nail-biting adventure, and they're getting away, and then you have the romance with like the beautiful heroine and her dashing hero and all this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It creates a different type of connection that makes people excited about learning about the history.
And I just have one more thing that goes back. As an educator, after Lovecraft Country, this is one of our resources, we created a class, and a lot of colleges did this also, but we created a class based on the story. One of the things we did was tour the Black Wall Street of Durham. So even though it talks about Tulsa in the show, there were Black Wall Streets in other places besides Tulsa, and so that was part of it. So the kids were able to learn even about their own state, you know, but the jumping off point was the show. We just want to be mindful of people's time. I know we're running a little bit past time, but if you can show the last slide. We wanted we have these slides available to you all if you're interested in it. If you just, you know, connect to the QR code. And also, if anybody's interested in what we do, if you're a geek and you like geeky things, and you like looking at it in terms of diversity and inclusion, we're Color Fandom. Those are we have a meetup group, we have a Facebook group, we do things live, we do things online. We have meetups and events all the time, all during the year, all during the week. So we would love to see some of y'all's faces.
Thank you guys so much for coming out.
Thank you very much.